Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on the second evening of events connected to the BFE Cut Above Awards. Tonight, we have all the nominees, not all the nominees, but the nominees for Best Edited British Documentary or Nonfiction Program and Best Edited Series Documentary or Nonfiction. This evening, let me just tell you who all the nominees would be, even if not all of them are able to join us tonight. So for Best Edited British Documentary or Nonfiction Program, we have 9/11 Inside the President's War Room with Danny Collins, who is here, hi Danny, and Mark Hamill. Then we have Cow by Nicolas Chaudeurge, sorry if I mistake someone's pronunciation, Rebecca Lloyd, who is here, and Jacob Secher-Schulzinger. And then we have Sean Mackenzie, who is the editor of Paul Merson, Football, Gambling and Me. And we have Cara and Blake and Mariko Montpetit, who are editors of Sisters with Transistors. And then the other category is Best Edited Series Documentary or Nonfiction. And tonight we'll have the nominees for Ambulance, Season 8, Olivia Baldwin, Luke Flight, Jess Illingworth, Manuela Lupini, Ruari Muir, and Pawel Slawek. So Pawel and Manuela should be able to come. And then we have the show Liverpool Narcos, edited by Tom Dixon Spain and Nadim Khan. Then we have the show The Beatles Get Back, edited by Jabez Olssen. No, sorry, Jabez Olssen. And finally, we have The Detectives Fighting Organized Crimes, edited by Sam Bergson, Otto Burnham, and Brad Manning. So congratulations for these achievements. It's really an honor for us to share little time with editors like you. And so, yeah, tonight we just want to celebrate and have a little chat among editors. From the audience, whenever you want, you can pop in the chat any questions that you want to ask to all of the guests or some of them specifically. So you are totally welcomed, and Stefania and Roberta will help us moderate these questions. So yeah, first of all, maybe since these are awards, we wanted to ask all of you to introduce yourself quickly, and most of all, introduce your show. Like, what is that about, and why a person should watch it? Like, so let's start with maybe Sean and Danny.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm Danny. I sort of edited 9/11 Inside the President's War Room, and the you know there've been so many films made about 9/11. When I was sort of about to cut it, I kind of binged on very many of them, and I suppose it's trying to sort of, there are so many stories about it, and gradually the director, Adam Wishart, had sort of managed to sort of arrange to get all of the people to agree to the interview, although we didn't realise we had George Bush until sort of halfway through the edit. We gradually worked up through the hierarchy of his sort of government, and once we got Condoleezza Rice and Cheney, he then agreed to do an interview, which he only gave an hour for. So the feeling behind the documentary was that we would, there are two versions actually. There's a BBC version and a version for Apple. I sort of predominantly worked on the BBC version, and it's a little bit more, it's a POV of George Bush and his government. The Apple version is a bit more of a 360 of the day with the government inside, so it was a slightly different approach, and it was co-production. In the end, the two films had to be separated, so it was logistically sort of quite complicated to figure out when the best time to do that was. That happened about 3 months before the very end of the edit. So so hopefully there are lots of insights that people wouldn't have heard of before. It was quite interesting that 20 years ago, it was one day, people's memories were quite different, just naturally, like if anyone was asked to remember a day 20 years ago. And we were just trying to find out when the most likely sort of truthful point that something happened was, and then go with that person's recollection. I think whatever you think of Bush, I think the film just lets you judge him. We let them tell their story, really. So hopefully worth a watch.
Cool.
Definitely worth a watch.
Worth for winning this. No. Joking. Sorry, Sean. I just interrupt you from introducing yourself because Mariko, if she's still here, she couldn't stay for too much. So maybe, are you still here, Mariko? Maybe she had to go away. Okay. Maybe
I think she's temporarily turned the thing off.
Oh, okay.
But since Sean is there, maybe we could
okay.
go ahead.
Sean. Yes, go. So, Sean, now it's your turn.
Hi. So, I'm an editor, but Danny and I are friends, and so we're not that far away. So we don't want to have a virtual glass of wine. We have a sort of real one together. That's why we thought we'd sort of do this together, be in the same place. Why should you watch Paul Merson, Football Gambling Me? I just think that program is quite an unusual program in its mix of elements. Paul Merson is a very engaging character, I think. Quite a story. The program has sort of a portrait of him. He's been famous on the football field, but also is known for gambling. Then him telling his story, he sort of really hasn't done it in that way. He was asked to do it and sort of took on the challenge. The whole thing is sort of for real, unfolds, not very long. But it's a mix of a portrait of him. There's science in it because he goes on a sort of journey to find out what's wrong with him, if he can, whatever they can look at from a scientific point of view. And then sort of meets his friends. So there's social side to things. He's quite a live wire, so you never quite know. Everything unfolded with him. He sort of nothing was prepared. It was kind of like, I'll turn up and I'll do whatever you say. So it's a very real like live events, really. The series of encounters where he is challenged and he's challenged and talks. So it's observational in that all those encounters were for real, and he had virtually no preparation for anything. And he's never done anything like that before. What he has done is he does talk about he knows really two things: football and gambling. That it's been his life. So he can talk about football forever, and that's what he does do. His job at Sky Sports. But the rest of his life has really been gambling for the whole of his life. So each of these things and going out and finding out, it was like, just felt like on the edge. So I just think it's quite an unusual film with a mix of elements that it's worth a watch to see what happens to him. And that was the challenge, throughout the edit. How would he react? What is he finding out? What does it mean? And letting him well, him letting allow us to see his sort of total discovery about his life. That's it, really.
Well, that's
Thank you.
great. Thank you so much. Now let's hear from Rebecca and about cow. It's really super interesting.
And can Nicolas join me as well?
Yeah, where are you here, Nicolas? Sorry. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm here. I don't know. Anyways, yeah, I'm here. Hi.
Nicolas. Yes, so we were obviously there's Jacob as well, 3 editors on Cow. I joined Cow. I had like a 4-year journey with Cow. I kind of started it just after American Honey, and they just started filming Malu and Luma. And my role was to just observe, watch, and assemble everything I saw. And there was a lot of footage, and it was kind of different stages throughout the 4 years. So I would be working on other things, but then there was no assistant either, so I was logging and syncing, organizing, and then assembling. So by the end of the 4 years, and on top of that, they also filmed a backup calf and cow, so I had 2 parallel assemblies going at the same time. So I ended up having, for Malu and Luma, like a 7-hour assembly that I presented to Andrea, and then we kind of worked together down to 4 hours. And then at that point, availability and everything happened. Nicolas Chaudeurge came on board to get it down to a more better size.
Yeah, so I had a much shorter journey on it, and of a few months, and it was a lot about getting it down to a feature length, and I didn't quite make it actually, and Jacob finished it after I got it down, but because the assembly was so long and everything was great, Becca has done everything great, but it was such a long journey, and it was a bit about killing the cow, I guess, and it was really interesting. I think it's a really interesting film. There's a lot of things that you couldn't really do. Like every time we cut to the cow seeing something, generally it pans back to her, or it starts with a pan from her, just to make sure that people see really that in the space, things were there. You need to sell it more, because you can't really see what she thinks this or she feels that. But we were really lucky because Andrea, she'd cast a really nice cow that looks really good, and she's got really nice shape in her face, and she was really she rebels a lot and she knocks the camera a lot, and there's this entire thing going on with the camera woman, which is quite incredible, sometimes aggressive, sometimes you can feel I think watching this film is a rare opportunity to feel like a cow for a little bit. Yeah.
So, sorry, Mariko, is it the same cow? Like
yeah, so Malu and Luma were the same. Yeah, all the way through. And it's amazing how, like, I know Andrea like just wanted Malu and Luma to be seen, and the biggest note was for all of us was just do not cheat anything. Just have to be real. If you don't need to cut, don't cut. And just watching her behavior, we all felt that we kind of really got to know Luma and kind of fell in love with her. It was an amazing journey, following them both.
Yeah, and what was nice is it was really not, but I mean, the thing about seeing the cow, I mean, I had Andrea for like a few weeks. I mean, for some days, all she would say on the loop is, "Oh, we see you, Luma. We see you, Luma. We see you, Luma. You need to see the cow. You need to see the cow," but like a mantra or something. But it was really about moments that you wouldn't normally include, like moments of not much. Yeah, so it's a documentary, but it's also not very documentary-like. And sometimes there's some scenes where you have to sneak in a bit of content through the vet or stuff like that. But it's quite a meditative film, so I think it's a quality.
Yeah, And she definitely had amazing behavioral instincts. Like my favorite moment is when she gets the little calf who's trying to step out of the pen, and she's attending to her black new calf, and then she kind of moves and goes over and brings her back in. And those little moments are just amazing. Just there were so many moments, but she had such a great character. Just had to make sure I watched a lot of rushes to make sure that all those moments got in there.
That's really interesting and lovely also. Like, yeah, she's beautiful, and it's incredible how your work says a lot without words, because of course there's a cow, but it's interesting. And so let's go to the final British documentary nominated, so Sisters with Transistors. So Cara and Mariko, if she can hear us.
I'm here.
Hi, Cara.
Hi. Yeah, so Sisters with Transistors is a documentary looking at the history of electronic music with a focus on the female pioneers that were part of that evolution. And the film kind of chose 9 women to center around, and they were active from as early as the 1920s through to the 70s and 80s. So we were dealing with quite a broad time period and pretty different styles between some of the women. And it's 100% archive based, pretty much. There were some contemporary interviews done that were used for sound, but the images were all archive. So it was really an evolving process from, I was sort of the first editor on the project who started doing the assembly, and we sort of tried to crystallize the important story aspects of each woman's story, and quickly discovered what was missing in terms of archive and what we would have to kind of really get creative, especially for some of the women who were active in the 20s. You know, there just really wasn't a lot of visual material to support the stories. So yeah, it was, as I said, an evolving process, especially like between sourcing and finding the archives. Our director, Lisa, just continually was looking for more and better stuff, like right up until the very end of the edit. And Mariko and our other editor, Michael Ogland, they did a tremendous job with some of the archives that I had never seen. So it was fun for me to see later cuts where there had been new, wonderful material discovered and implemented into, you know, what we had sort of started with. So yeah, it was really, it was a long process. I think the film took through at least 3 years, and you know, the edit process didn't take that. It wasn't continually going on that whole 3 years. It was kind of went in a few different waves, but yeah, these things take time, as everybody knows.
Mariko, if you also want to share with us, like shortly, your experience with Sisters with Transistors.
You're mute.
What Cara was saying was pretty much right. It was very difficult to find footage to work from. But what I found working with Lisa was that she had a very fluid way she wanted to tell the story, and the feature version was a musical journey more than the TV version, obviously, but it was a pleasure to have the space to explore those emotional spaces rather than having a strong narrative connection that way.
So you decided, like, after watching all the footage, how to structure, or you had already some guideline or stuff?
No, there was a sense that there were, you know, just a chronological way in wasn't so relevant. Our notion of what electronic music is starts from a certain time, you know, say, you know, synthesizers. So we picked the woman that had this strong footage from that time, impressive, you know, young woman on her own doing her own show. That was Susan, I think. She looked like 18 years old or something. She might have
Suzanne
been.
Ciani, yeah.
Yeah. And so we decided to go with that and then kind of go back in steps in different ways and then jump forward in time. And yeah, there was a sense that, you know, we have to start from the audience's idea of what electronic music is and then break it down slowly, step by step.
Super. Cool, thank you so much. So is there, let's go to the, if we have them, to Jabez. Are you still with us?
Hello.
Okay, yes. Hi. So let's talk about your documentary, who also is all based on archive, right?
Yes, we too were just limited to archive footage. We, the Beatles company Apple Corps had about 60 hours of footage on the shelf, along with about 130 hours of audio that went with it. Most of it had never been seen. You know, the original documentary, Let It Be, was released in 1970, and it used about 80 odd minutes of the show. But there was a lot they couldn't show back then. There were a lot of vetoes on the project as to what could and couldn't go in. So we got all the footage, and we spent over 3 years going through it, and it was supposed to be just one film for cinema release, but somehow, thanks to the pandemic and just the amount of content, we ended up as 3 films on Disney Plus.
How did you feel? How did you feel when you discovered that it would have not been like a cinema release?
Well, it was slightly disappointing not to be in a cinema, but at that point, the world was very, it was uncertain as to whether anyone would see our film if we did go into a cinema. So it just became a practical decision to switch over to the streaming platform. And by that stage, Disney had purchased the film, so they had a streaming platform all ready to go. And, you know, it did allow us to make the film longer and get more content in there, which I think does help, even though it's a big time commitment to watch it. It's almost 8 hours, but there would have been a lot we would have had to leave on the shelf, and that would have been a shame after 50 years. So I think it was the right decision.
Cool. Okay, thank you so much. So let's go to Tom Dixon Space, the editor of Liverpool Narcos. Hi, Tom. You're mute. Okay.
Hello. Yeah, I'm
Hi.
not muted anymore. Hi there. Yes, Liverpool Narcos. So it was a 3-part series that was looking at the drug trade as it appeared in Liverpool from the early 80s. And the three films were split up into the 3 different drugs, which were roughly chronological, from heroin through to ecstasy through to cocaine. And it was really it was an attempt really to make a series. It's a social history of Liverpool in some respects, and through the prism of drugs, because it's a huge part of that city. And it was also an attempt to not make it a harrowing experience to watch, but something that portrayed both the glamour and the downside of being a drug dealer. So a lot of the people who were involved were drug dealers who'd served time and were now out, some who'd served tens of years, some who'd served small amounts, some who got away with it. And it was just charting that history. And one of the interesting aspects of it was that Anthony Phillipson, who was the director, had decided that they talked about recreations and that it'd be nice to recreate certain little moments, as happens in a lot of these sort of documentaries. And his decision was to actually, with the recreations, make 4 separate dramatic sequences that made a whole story, a whole narrative of one of the characters that dovetailed to the end of the documentary with the documentary footage to tell their whole story. So unusually it was scripted, and it was so there was dialogue, and so I think that was sort of a brave move, and had, I think, good results, and sort of brought some of those funnier stories alive, and you know, allowed the characters to sort of flesh out a bit more. And then, you know, to sort of, one of the challenges was how to make something that was potentially quite grim, entertaining. And what we decided was that in the end, it was a sort of cross between a spaghetti western and a heist movie. And so we were using music to do exactly that. And the composer, Matt Davidson, then took Morricone scores and Lalo Schifrin scores and started to create a score for our series that sort of reflected that sort of type of thing, which really brought the whole thing alive. So yeah, we go.
Thank you so much. And I think, unfortunately, we don't have anyone from the detectives, right? Am I missing? Okay. So let's go to Manuela from Ambulance. And Pawel, I don't think Pawel is here.
This is Pawel.
So, yeah. Sorry. Of course. Hi, Pawel.
So hi.
Yeah. Hi.
So do you want to start?
No, you go.
Okay. Well, Ambulance is a returning series, and it follows kind of the ambulances and the story of the people who are treated by the service, and obviously it also tells the story of the greater pressures that the NHS is under. So usually it follows let's say the ambulance and the people who get treated, but also there's like a parallel story in the control room with the people who send out the ambulances, and then all the pressures that are ongoing. So, you know, if an ambulance gets blocked, or so it's trying to tell those stories simultaneously and working out how to best tell the story of a shift or of a night or over 2 nights, and the pressures that you know comes with.
Yeah, well, I think what's special about this nomination is that, obviously, as Manuela said, this is a returning series 8, in fact. So I was really surprised. So I treat it as a sort of nomination to a series as a whole, and what the team have achieved over the last, I don't know, whatever that was, 7 years. I've personally done 4 episodes so far. I think that's it, probably. But I do think it's quite a special series. You know, in all, there's so many medical series in the UK, but I always like returning to this one because for me it really feels like a documentary, you know, which I think that's what makes it a bit different. Hopefully for you as well.
And another thing is each episode, it feels like a single film. So there's no like a specific format. I mean, obviously over the years there are formulas into it and so on, but every time you get, let's say, a set of rushes, you have to work out how to tell that specific story, you know, and no film is alike, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting, actually, because I think for series documentary editors, how important or difficult it is to find a common ground. Like if a person edits one episode and the other edits another episode, or if the people work together on one episode, it's really fascinating how like you can achieve actually like a structured and cool show, but being more people. So can you tell us your secret?
I'm not sure I know the secret. I think it's all about collaboration. There is obviously, we each work with a director, and then obviously with the executive producers, there is a lot of discussions about the stories. So obviously our job is getting into the cutting room and immediately going through loads and loads of rushes and pinpointing those stories which stand out. But then there is a big thing in this kind of series, which is consent. So maybe even if you choose an incredible story, that story might fall through like one day before transmission, and it's sometimes they have to just replace it at the very last minute. So sometimes you're in the last week and you have to cut a story from scratch, and so you have your plan B's kind of in case a story falls through. In fact, I think you had that.
I had that time every single episode, and I think that's one good experience that I've taken from it, is that you should never get too attached to your material, and you should always have plan B, because there's no point otherwise. But in terms of collaborating, I think what's quite good about this series as well is that the execs definitely, they appreciate that you as an editor want to have an ownership of a program. You want to feel like you're editing a film. So there isn't so much of like, you cut this story, I'll cut that story, that other guy cuts another story, and we put it together. It's more like, no, you are given a film and they want you to start to finish it, which doesn't always happen, obviously, for various reasons, but that is the idea from the beginning. So if you see 3 or 4 editors at the end of the credits, that usually means that obviously that program ran into troubles. But that's
such as consent issues, exactly. Or stories falling through at last minute and so on. But yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And actually, this connects with the question that Stuart asked on the chat. So if some of you would have preferred maybe a longer final version of their show. For example, Rebecca, you told us that your first cut was 7 hours long. So maybe if some of you would prefer a format like the Beatles had, so maybe a series or something that can go to a streaming platform instead, that being a feature or things like that.
With Cow, I think because it's such like a visceral, immersive experience, seeing it from start to finish, I feel you enter the world and it's from start to finish. So if it kind of went, I don't know, I feel that it would have lost its magic if it was 7 hours long. But I do like other documentaries I've worked on, an assembly can be ended up being 3 hours, and now we're making it into like a 3-part series. So I think it all depends on the material. But with Cow, I definitely feel like it serves as an entity in its own journey.
Cool. Thank you. And if anyone else of you nominees want to share. Yeah, sure.
I think what Becca said is really great, because it's challenging. It's very fulfilling film, but it's challenging. And what's nice to see with an audience, which I did like twice, is that the audience stay captive and they're into it. But obviously, there's moments where they get bored. The Cows, they don't make albums like the Beatles and stuff. And so if you make it longer, there's some stuff that would have been really nice in there. But if you make it too long, then people get detached and they don't experience as much. Yeah. But I think sometimes I've done some documentaries that it was about information. There was a lot of information, and the director wanted to make it feature length or limited. And some of them, it could have been better longer, because you'd have more detail and then it'd be more interesting.
Okay. Thank you. Is there any other question? Or
no, there's nothing else so far.
So I will jump in. I will jump in, sorry, with a question which is probably a bit complicated, but since many of you edit about sensitive topics, I wanted to ask you your opinion about how to choose what to keep and what to give away. Most of all, when, for example, it's dealing with patients, people who suffers, people who disclose a secret, something that can hurt them actually in the future, because maybe they give consent to say something now, but maybe you feel that in the future this could hurt them. Or, for example, when it's regarding politics, for example, like Danny that you edited, like George Bush now, and maybe he says something that you don't trust or that you hate. So how can you choose what to keep and what to give away? Yeah.
Well, it's, in some, it depends on who the subject is. Sort of certainly made films in hospitals, very vulnerable people, and you feel huge responsibility. So it just all depends on who the person is. And with George Bush, obviously, you don't feel much responsibility. He's sort of big enough to take care of himself, and has got a lot to sort of answer for. But so in a way, on that day, he seemed to do quite a good job. The film was hopefully just trying to follow a human being who his politician, he's got himself into being president, and whatever baggage that's got, he's still a person, and he's started off the day having a run with a member of the press corps, and then he's trying to get his sort of domestic policy going, and he's into his education, and he's got this policy of no child left behind, which has got sort of widespread support across the House. So he's feeling like he's doing quite good things. Then all of a sudden this huge thing happens, and you follow this guy who's gradually deciding through that day, that he's going to take America into the longest war to date it's ever had. But the interview with him was only an hour long, so there wasn't really much left behind. And it's the planning behind that interview was massive. The amount of questions, how long his answers took, and then if you've got this much time, can you ask that question, and that much time, you gradually go down the list. And so Adam, the director, did an amazing job sort of managing that. So there was nothing really. I suppose it was this decision on a couple of the questions to actually put Adam in, and it was their story, but occasionally, on two occasions, there felt like there had to be a big question answered. So there wasn't really much left behind as far as Bush was concerned.
Thanks.
Anyone else want to add?
Can I just add something? This time around, my film, we had a story about domestic violence, and so what happened was on the day that a woman was abused, like she was assaulted by her ex-partner, the cameras were following her and the ex-partner. So the ex-partner went and he tried to commit suicide. So it was a big responsibility to tell that story, in a sensitive, very sensitive way. And obviously all the way through, we were talking to them. But at one point we had to make the decision, how do we tell the story? Do we show him first or her first? And so we decided to show him first, because you would feel a bit for him. Otherwise, you just couldn't recover after you find out that he's done this to this poor lady. So it was an interesting choice as well, like in terms of structuring that story, and obviously being truthful and very sensitive about the whole thing. So it was very interesting. And in the end, we couldn't include some of the things from the original cut just because of legal reasons, and also they requested for some of the stuff to be taken out. So that's probably, how we dealt with it, because they agreed that if we would take out certain information, then the story could be told. So yeah, that was it. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a question on the chat, Claudia.
Yes.
From Lizzie Hessling. I'd like to ask, when you make an archive documentary, do you start with an idea of the story, a rough script? If not, how do you start? Can somebody from archive material, who's
I'll
there?
talk about on the Beatles. We did not start with an idea or a script. We just watched all the footage. And then we tackled it one day at a time, and we just tried to find the story that was there, and that was just a matter of we cut what we call the scenes, that were in the footage, string them all together. I mean, our initial edit was about 17 hours long, I think, and it was a constant process of trying to work out what the story was going to be, what story was there. And, and as we started to discover that, which took a while, then we would have to go back and look at all the footage we had not used to see if these new story ideas were actually already in the footage, and that we had just missed them. And, and so we had to, it was a constant process of going back to see if what other material was there that worked for the story that was evolving. But there was no predetermined ideas. It was just all watching the footage and seeing what actually happened, and letting the story emerge.
Anybody else would like to add anything about archive?
I don't know about archive, but I was just thinking about the vulnerability question.
Oh yeah, sure.
I mean, the whole of Cow is about vulnerability. You just feel like that cow's in front of you. Well, what's going to happen to the cow? Everything is about vulnerability. The whole film just is walking in mud. It's being milled. Babies are being separated, and then in the end we're watching it being, killed in front of us. It's vulnerable. So I just think that that film is about the vulnerability of that animal. That's what the whole film was to me. So I felt it was interesting you were saying earlier, not a documentary. I thought it, or something like that. It was completely observed. It was a document of that cow's life in that 90 minutes. I thought it was amazing. And, basically watching that story unfold without commentary, without voices, without music, without anything else going on, I thought it was completely unique. It just made me think about lots of other films. It's like, well, I've got Paul Merson in front of me. He's vulnerable in a different way. We're watching him find out what happens. It's not going to, no one's going to pull the trigger, but it's, in a way they are. They're sort of looking at him. This is what your brain looks like. Mm-hmm. So in terms of his vulnerability and him having to answer for it, it's like, those things are quite unusual. We're very privileged to just be able to see people in front of us reacting to information and them agreeing to do it. That's what's pretty extraordinary that we're able to do. So I just was very aware of, in a way, Cow made me think about a lot of other films. I think that was its achievement.
Does Nicolas want to say something?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so nice what you're saying. But yeah, that was one of the things that was really interesting about the cow. Like I said about the point of view and so editing it, you had to ask yourself a lot of questions. But even when she knocks the camera woman, you don't really know why she does it. Well, when she gets separated with the calf, it's obvious she's really pissed off. But at the time, you don't really know. So, and it's a film that makes you wonder what it is to be an audience and what it is to be a character. So it's
Exactly.
quite nice for that.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think if it was a person, there's a lot of moments we couldn't show. But, you know, at the same time, there's always a bit of play and a bit of commentary. And with Sky was in the songs, and they changed through the edits and stuff.
Of course, yeah.
They get played on the radio. But there was a little... The best ones were actually really playing at the time, like the Christmas one. But otherwise, it was fun with Andrea choosing stuff and things. That was a bit of cheating as well. It's always nice a bit.
So there's another question here about so where is the archive material sourced from? I guess it depends, doesn't it? There are archives, and can anybody answer that? Do you know? Yeah,
I wanted to ask Cara and Mariko, in fact, if they want to share as well their experience with the footage. Also answering the previous question.
Do you remember, Cara, where most of it, because I got on board a little bit afterwards, but there was a lot of...
Well, there were a lot of different sources, I think, by the end. If you look at the credits, you know, there's always a long list, but some of the segments that came together the earliest were because Lisa had access to some family personal archives. And that's always, you know, kind of a treasure trove when you can tap into something that hasn't already been used a lot and people haven't seen before. But yeah, I think she sourced a lot of stuff from the BBC and Kino Library. And
yeah, there was Kino Library. There were loads of reels with various different elements. So she would very Kino Library, I think, is offers a service where you can kind of give them a theme and they'll give you a reel of stuff, which is pretty helpful. And she selected all of it, right? Because it was all selected by the time I jumped in.
Yeah. She made most of the selects. I mean, sometimes it was obvious, you know, which footage had something special, you know, but I think back to the question about like how do you begin, I think that is a big part of the process of making an archive-based doc is just looking at the material that you have access to and seeing what stands out and, you know, what could be a starting point or the seed of some kind of scene.
Yeah, so it's a long process, isn't it?
How did
you can start with the script, but the script, especially
changes.
Changes a lot, I think. Yeah.
You know how the 9 the women that got chosen, how they weren't the only one. I hope. Like, how did they get chosen?
They were the only ones she could cover visually.
Okay.
I think that was the one.
Yeah, which is a bit unfortunate. I mean, she doesn't. You know, she wasn't ever trying to present the film as being completely comprehensive because, of course, there were other women in other parts of the world, especially, but yeah, they weren't documented or even less documented than the ones that were included. So yeah, it's too bad that some
hard
some
to
women
access
didn't
or hard to find. Yeah. At some point, your own reach is how far you can go.
Yeah, I was thinking about that question of like, could we have made it into an episodic show, which it sort of lends itself to that, you know, being about 9 different women, but at the same time, I don't think we would have had the material to support it. And also what I find most interesting about the film is kind of the connections that were made between the women and putting them in dialogue with one another and giving it sort of that context of how they were making their music. And often they didn't know about each other, so that made it even more interesting to see them put together.
I thought that there was the historical context, the elements around each woman were very indicative of the decisions they made and how they were influenced. And very often it was because of the context that their decisions were even more impressive somehow. So those were, elements of the technology versus, what's going on. Like the World Expo had an impact on Daphne Oram and.
Yeah, so it wasn't just about finding archive material specifically of the women. A lot of it was just providing that kind of temporal context.
Yeah. So forgive my pronunciation. Jabez. Is that correct? So Stuart asks, Jabez, at what point did you realize the richness of the extra audio content?
Well, pretty quickly, I guess is the answer. We had a lot more audio than we had picture, just because I guess it was cheaper to roll the Nagra recorders than it was to shoot 16 millimeter footage. We also found that when the cameras weren't running, they would be a bit more open with what they were talking about or their responses. So often when the cameras weren't running but the audio was running, that was when the Beatles would open up a bit more and say some more interesting things. So that became pretty apparent pretty quickly, and we had to work out how to incorporate audio that had no picture into the film, which was always a challenge, and that's what we did.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's also a question from Sasha. When I spend a long time editing, I find that I become numb to the material after a while. In what ways do you avoid this happening to you if it does happen? I can tell by the laughter that everybody recognizes that moment. Can anyone pick up from here? So how do you avoid this happening to you?
I can, it's funny because many years ago, back at film school, I asked that exact question to Tariq Anwar, who you probably know, responsible for films like American Beauty or King's Speech. And he basically had no idea what I was talking about. Apparently it doesn't happen to him. He genuinely said it does not happen to him. So maybe you're lucky. Well, I'm not like that. For me, I think the best way is basically change the environment, maybe watch it with someone else, maybe have a couple of drinks, basically disconnect from it. Because if you keep watching it in the same room, in the same position, it probably you may get numb very, very quickly. So that would be my advice, to just change the environment and maybe the people you're watching it with. That's, for me, that makes a huge difference, a different person in the room.
Yeah, I think when there's a presence there, that somehow you see things differently, don't you? Anybody else have any tip?
Well, I'd just say it's your first experience with it is trust your first instincts, because so often you go around with a cut and you go through all sorts of pain and you end up kind of where you started, a refined version of.
Yeah, I agree with that. The first instinct is the most precious. The first time you watch rushes is the most precious.
You have to remember it, don't you?
Yeah. And then also not overwatching, I find that having conversations with the director and understanding what the story is before I start overwatching is also helpful. But yeah, definitely exactly what you said.
There's also a question directly to Sisters with Transistors. So the question is, was it clear from the beginning that you would have Laurie Anderson as the narrator instead of including her in the group of women that were portrayed?
I think she was never meant to be part of the women, correct? Right?
Yeah.
She's too successful, I think.
I think Elisa had also kind of a time frame in mind for the film, and Laurie was just a little bit beyond that, but also so much connected to that world that she made sense as the narrator. But I'm not sure at what point she was confirmed. I think it was pretty late in the...
Very last minute.
Yeah.
Very last minute.
I know she had some ideas of other people in mind, but it was a big win to get Laurie Anderson there in the final moments. It's funny that like when we cut like a very, very early trailer, you know, for her to get some funding, and she had Jarvis Cocker do the voiceover, who has, you know, an amazing voice and presence and is a great celebrity, you know, to have attached, but like became quickly apparent that maybe having, you know, this male authoritative voice didn't really fit the film. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think Laurie Anderson is kind of a perfect fit.
Mm. I think it often, who becomes this voiceover has a huge impact on the film. The voice of authority on a subject has to come from that person. It's very hard to give authority to someone when it's a specific subject. Who was it? There was another film I remember. Lauryn Hill, was it? The singer that escaped paying taxes and was jailed for it? Yeah, I remember watching a film and thinking, because she's got that personal experience, she has some authority over whatever she was talking about. These kinds of things you can't fake somehow.
So there's no more questions on the chat. If anybody else, Claudia, would you like to ask any more?
I have a question to Tom, and I think this is more for you. But if anyone else wants to answer, I think that sometimes when we work a lot on a specific genre of work, like our life, our way of perceiving life is a bit affected by that. That's why I work on a preschool children's series, so that my life feels joyful. But so I was thinking about you, Tom, since like you have worked with this strong series. Have you had to like detach or use particular ways of like feeling that you can be safe, even if in our cities, etc. After that you work for so many hours talking about crime and how it is actually so deep and present in our daily life and streets.
I mean, interestingly, I think certainly Anthony felt like that he was interviewing proper gangsters, and there was a sense that you know, this whole thing about sensitivity, if you know, there was a sense that they might be able to implicate themselves, and they knew where he lived, so you know, he was concerned about that, I think. And you know, any names on the, you do feel like there is a sense that if they feel like they're being stitched up, and there was a lot of material about you know, there were quite a few people who got away with stuff, and a few of them did talk about it in interview, and there was a fine line between admitting it or, you know, you can admit crimes that you have been prosecuted for, but to admit that you got away with stuff, and then for that to go out, and for authorities to see that, and then that to be actioned on, yeah, I think, you know, they were scary characters, some of them. So, but personally, I didn't feel that. I mean, I felt that a lot more keenly on other films that I've done, but this one, not so much.
Thank you.
Actually, can we throw that question at Cow as well? Because obviously, do you stop, you know, films like this are also supposed to make you think a bit about your lifestyle and the choices you make in terms, you know, obviously drinking milk, eating cheese, all that sort of stuff. How did that impact you working on it?
Nicolas, come and join me on this. But I know that Andrea didn't want, obviously, that she didn't have any political message at all in making Cow. With the drinking milk, like I'm an almond, but I'm lactose intolerant anyway, so I don't drink milk. But I obviously probably would have stopped drinking milk while working, if I did. And I'm not vegan or a vegetarian, but I haven't been able to eat beef since working on Cow. But I don't know that she didn't really have a message. It was all about being seen with and in the farm is an amazing farm, and you only really see their legs and not really in the film, but it was a good farm and they were treated well. So yeah, Nicolas.
Well, I mean, it was a big thing, this, and the big thing was to completely avoid it and never engage with it, the debate, because it would kill the film. It would become like a film for this. It was really not about that. And the debates that it actually connected with that are really present in, I mean, the UK might be a bit more ahead in terms of those debates about animal consciousness, animal feelings, conscious farming. They've been in the French press and in European and worldwide press more and more. So it was really actual, but it was really about that, about getting a sense of the cow and not having any agenda with it. Even though Andrea is obviously very sensitive about those things, she's vegetarian. I don't know if she eats milk or not. Personally, I think milk is wonderful, butter is wonderful. If we didn't use them, we didn't have so many cows. It was more like the thing about the horns, why they take them. We sort of connected with Agnès Varda and her last film, was it Faces, Places, where she goes in villages and she interrogates this thing of with the chef, goat, why they take off their horns, because not necessary. And same thing with separating the calf and the cow. Is it necessary to do it so early? I don't think they used to, but you also have to be careful because you've come from the outside. And like Becca said, there were some farmers involved and they committed to the film. They were very helpful and they do a good job. So, and stuff like Andrea was obsessed with the gates and farms. I didn't know farms were so automatized with big robots and stuff. And it looks very oppressive. But I think part of it lets the cows have a certain agenda and be able to move as they want as receptors. It gives them a form of freedom as well. It's hard to understand those things. But in terms of the debate about milk and stuff, it was really to be avoided. Just so people couldn't be easily for or against the film.
It's interesting to hear that because, that also in this, it was a Cowspiracy came out not long ago. So obviously the debate is out there. So I thought it was worth asking.
But it's really multi-layered because some other stuff that's been in the news is how the farming industry is totally underpaid. They don't get any money. Okay. So a lot of people walk away from it and stuff. It's really complex, this kind of stuff.
Very much. So yeah, definitely.
Can I just add, I think, on that sort of aspect of politics and kind of having polemics, that I think it certainly in the films that we were doing, which is in Liverpool, which self-confessed the most left-wing city in Britain, and I think they call themselves an independent state a lot of the time, and there's a lot of the sort of social history in Liverpool is very much steeped in that anti sort of Tory government, very, 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 very political. But there's a feeling when you're doing that kind of thing that you need to try and pull back from that and look at it. You use that to show how people get into the situation they're in terms of drugs and trafficking and using drugs, but not to make it a polemic, because I don't think, there are films you either set out to make a polemic or you set out to tell those individual stories and try and step back from it and not, put your hand in as the narrator to kind of edge it in a particular direction. Just like in Cow, you don't want to go there because it's I mean, does it cheapen it? I think it does cheapen it a bit, that you start feeling like you're trying to make a point, and that's the last thing you want to be doing, is trying to make, certainly I felt like that in this. You want to tell the stories of these people as honestly as you can and show how they got into the situations they got into, which, you know, in the case of Liverpool Narcos was, you know, they had 95% unemployment on an estate. Now, the reasons for that unemployment are many, but that's not really what we're about. It's about that fact that pushed them into it. Another documentary can deal with that. And I think it's, you know, the same with one of the main characters in the first film that we dealt with, who is the main dealer of heroin, although he doesn't admit it, in Liverpool in the 80s. He was black, and he talks about racism, and he talks about the fact that the defining moment in his life was a racist attack, which just ruined all his chances in his life. Now, we don't need to go further into that or make anything about that. That's his story. And I think it's a really interesting point with documentaries, where that line is, where you know, are you setting out to be polemic, or are you setting out to do something that's not? And I think it's an interesting question to ask at the start of the process. And that's something that certainly we were talking about right at the beginning of the process of making that series.
Yeah, it's just choose which is the story, and just stick with that rather than wander around, because it's really easy not to wander about in these situations.
Well, on the Paul Merson film, I missed some of that conversation, but on the Paul Merson film, I mean, he's finding out stuff about the gambling industry he didn't know. You know, he's confronted with facts, figures. You know, one of the last scenes when he's with the Gambling with Lies families, those parents have lost children, suicide. Someone commits suicide every day from gambling things. You know, that was the last thing he wanted. He didn't want to be there. He didn't want to be in that scene, but felt he had to, and didn't have much to say in it. But what I'm saying is, you know, whether it's a polemic or not, literally on that whole film, he's finding out stuff about issues, current affairs, politics, what the government are doing, how the banks operate, literally for the first time. That was, you know, one of the things that I thought was extraordinary about his journey. You know, he literally, my favorite scene is halfway through the film where, you know, it's the last thing they filmed with him in the last week of the edit. He told this story about bank statements, and, you know, I called them up, you know, no one listened to me. I could show you the bank statements. So it was sort of bottom on the list on the last day to kind of, okay, it's going to be bank statements, he's going to do this. But in fact, you know, he's pulled the box off the kitchen surface and started reading out 3,000, 4,000, 10,000, 8,000, all the money that he'd spent. No one in the bank had done that, had, you know, made any sort of intervention. You know, so he was literally showing us what he'd done 4 years ago with no result that came from it. And that's what it would be like for, you know, so many people. So it's a bit like, you know, whether it's a polemic or any of those issues, so many of these things just come out within the film. You know, when the guy's telling him about how the banks operate, he spent his whole life in gambling. He didn't know they did all this. He's literally nodding along. So I found all that completely fascinating.
You know, I think, like, for me, a polemic feels, you know, you've got an agenda, and in a way, it automatically feels like you're manipulating the arguments and the material, and in a way, life's very complex, and in all sorts of ways, and there are no easy answers. You watch these things, it's you know, like the Paul Merson film just made me feel angry about the whole gambling thing, and how there's advertising everywhere, and, you know, there are these very vulnerable people that are addicted to it and are going to get sucked in. And you know, I've not yet seen the Cow film. I have definitely got to see that, but certainly from what you're saying, there, you know, there's no agenda there. It speaks for itself, and certainly with you know, 9/11, there are all sorts of things about, you know, should he have known, and all the things that happened after that were, you know, absolutely sort of, you know, indefensible. You know, definitely shouldn't have gone to Iraq. But you're just trying to deal with that one day and what he did, and not put a polemic on it. Let people judge that day. And I just think, if you avoid the polemic, it's a far more interesting film.
Can I just say, I think exactly the War Room film, I thought did that brilliantly, avoided the polemic brilliantly. I mean, it was such a great experience to watch something that wasn't telling you how to perceive what you were watching, but just being told what happened. And actually, particularly when he was told what happened with the kids in the school, you know, that has been written about in a very different way than was presented in the film, which I found quite sort of well, I just thought it was great that you didn't go down that rabbit hole at all, and you could just. And as you say, only you ended the film at the point that it could become polemic, which was great. You know, the last moment of that film was the point at which, you know, there was any sort of any sense that it was going to get like that. So it was really, really, really good.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just jump in to say that we have gone a bit over, but it's totally fine because we can keep talking, since the topic that was raised is really interesting.
Rebecca is about to leave. So
bye, Rebecca, and
thank you.
Bye, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
And
Bye.
if anyone else has to leave, like, you're totally free to go, but if you are totally free to stay as well and keep chatting. So yeah,
there's a I don't know who was talking just a second ago, if they wanted to finish what they were saying, but there's a question on the chat about how do you start editing after getting so much footage. I mean, all of you work on the one film. You all got lots of footage. So Sabina asked, either you go to interviews and start editing, listening, cutting, or you go to research yourself with a particular given topic, or what is the process? I think
it just varies every single time. It's different. I mean, I feel I was lucky on the Paul Merson film in that the first day's filming they did with him was a 4-hour interview, where because they didn't know that, you know, how vulnerable with how sort of volatile he is, quite, you know, what they would get. So he was brilliant. He sat in the chair for 4 hours, answered every single question, told everything. He's, you know, there's tears, there's laughter, there's jokes. There's sort of, he goes into sort of after dinner mode in certain stories, or football stories, and he's in personal stories. Literally 4 hours. So the first day's filming, and this particular film was the perfect overview for the rest of the film, because he had said everything, and then as the scenes unfolded in an observational way, he obviously repeated a lot of that story to the people where he was with. That's what he's used to saying, that's what he wants to say, that is his experience. So on the Paul Merson film, I think day one, watching a 4-hour interview, the master interview with him, which wasn't done again in any form, was the perfect start to that particular edit. That was unusual.
Anybody else would like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will often start, for me, it often starts with, as you say, it depends on the film, it's observational, as opposed to archive. You know, archive, I will always start with interviews, always, and go through that. And actually, I usually take my cue from the director. The director quite often will say, this is what you need to watch first. This will give you a sort of good grounding in what's going on. And then I think, as to, you know, your own research, I think that comes as a result of watching those interviews and talking to the director. So in the end, with the Liverpool Narcos film, it was very much watching the main interviews, because that that provided the inspiration for all the archive and for all the drama and for everything in the film. I think Anthony had he had an idea of the history of the drug trade, but he was very much steered by the people who were living through it, and their stories were the thing that guided where we looked for archive, where we started cutting, you know, where the structure of the whole series. So, but I think if you're, you know, as you're saying with the Merson film, if you're working with something that's observational, that's a very different setup. You know, you may start with interviews, or you may start with watching the actuality, because that may reveal more than the interviews, or vice versa. So, you know, it's, as you say, it's a very much depends on the project.
Yeah, it's absolutely that, isn't it? It's what's the motor, what drives the film, and certainly with archive, it's interviews, and you know, I'm certainly for the Bush film, I read his sort of biography first and noted how important the 14th of September was, and it kind of played my reading of that book played a big part in that actually sort of forming part of the film, because in a way that was the conclusion of his thoughts to go to war. And I'm doing a film at the moment about sort of Topshop and Philip Green, and I've read a kind of a biography about Green for that, and you know, sometimes you just need all sorts of background knowledge on those sort of archive-based films, but then with an observational film, it's totally different. You just have to immerse yourself in it and gradually start reading all the subtleties of it and figuring out the story. So it's such a different experience, you know. And it's kind of what I love about it. You just keep learning different types of films. You learn something different. Yeah,
and I think that's what most of us, you know, we're lucky enough to go from one film, which is interviews and archive, and then the next one is observational. So, you know, it varies all the time. I mean, I've just started something on 22 interviews. That's the starting point. You know,
you never stop learning. You never stop learning.
Yeah.
Good stuff. What about Ambulance? That team is being quiet.
We're listening to all the.
So the question is, where do you start?
Yes, how do you start with something like that? But actually, I have a specific question, because I guess there's two things really. When you watch series like that, they all have the same intro or similar intros. I think for each series, they have this little package at the beginning that kind of introduces, what do you call it?
They call it pre-titles.
The pre-titles, who puts that together? Are you given the job to do it? Does it actually change during the series? I'm not sure. It seems to have a...
Well, in this series, actually, it was me. I cut the pre-title. In the previous series, it was him. And I think what happens is, in each series has its own pre-title, so it will be the same for
each episode. Yeah.
No, well, not for each episode. For the 6 episodes in that series, it's the same. And I mean, they are very similar throughout the series, but it's always obviously different.
Different episode, like different.
And there are variations, but it's kind of, it's more or less the same. I think originally it used to be like 2.5 minutes, and I think they've realized it needs to be really short. People know what they're watching, and now I think it's kind of gone down to 1 minute and something, but it's quite short.
Yeah. And how do you start with the footage that presumably you receive all sorts of stories. What's the process at that point?
Yeah, so specifically on Ambulance, we're given quite a lot of rushes per episode, because usually you're given maybe 2, 3, 4 shifts. So each shift is basically following of, I think, about 8 crews. Each shift is 12 hours. So you can imagine that's 12 times 8 times 3. per one episode. So obviously you can't just like watch everything, because that's going to take you probably 6 weeks to just watch that. So luckily the people who film it, they make notes or, you know, while shooting, which is crazy because there's only one person filming it. Only one.
Oh, really? Wow.
No one else, no sound person, no PD, additional director. So they also, on top of everything, they have to make notes and rate those stories. So you can't.
But the ratings can't trust because.
But you're roughly, you know,
it's tough, isn't it? Because they're kind of following the story, and at the same time they have to.
Yeah, no, and then somebody might say, you know, this story isn't very good, but then you go and watch the rushes, and actually that, you know, that story can work for different reasons, and there is good, there is potential in the story. So, you know, you can't really trust that, but I think what happens is you're given your crews, and you're given like a very big map on the wall of the potential stories that are very, very good. So you always start with that, and obviously because in Ambulance you need to choose 2 or 3 crews that you're going to follow in the episode. So you commit to the paramedics as your main characters, really. Oh, and obviously the patients as well, but you're following them. So when you decide who to follow, it kind of becomes very clear that, you know, all this material you can kind of avoid, and then you go with, you know, with your strongest characters. So that's how you start, but it is a lot of footage to start. Yeah.
Can I ask how long it takes to do one episode?
And also, what are your deadlines? Because how much time do you have for episode?
You're given originally given around 9 to 10 weeks. And if you're very lucky, you will finish your episode within 10 weeks. But I think that very rarely happens. They usually go over, but not much. So I would say usually we'll finish it within, say, 14 weeks tops, you know. I think I only finished one within 10 weeks. But usually, in terms of how do you start, just to follow that, you usually spend first 2-3 weeks just watching the material. Nothing, you don't do nothing. Because, and then you have a meeting. The first viewing is after about 2-3 weeks where you just talk and you tell your execs what. So that's when it's really important, your judgment as an editor, because they really trust you. So if you tell them, I think these 6 stories are best, they will trust you. But if you're wrong, obviously, you know, they remember that.
And in that story, they call it a story chat. You can show them snippets of like the best bits of things that you think might work, and then you begin to build a picture of the structure of the film. So obviously the structure is based on, you know, for example, if you decide that you have a really good shift, a night shift, 12 hours straight, which is a really difficult film to make, but you might get very lucky and a lot of stuff happens in 12 hours, then that is a discussion because you have to follow the chronology of the night. But you also might get stories across 2 days. So then that's another discussion. Do we go day from night? What do we start with? And all of those discussions usually happen already in that story chat. So it's very informal, and you show very little clips, but you have to be very selective very quickly, you know, and kind of go to the heart of what, you know, what's the strongest material, so you can kind of line it up and have that discussion early on.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Christopher. Hi, can I ask what were your relationships with your assistants like on your shows? How did they contribute? Do you work with assistants? Who works with assistants?
No assistants on the films I've worked on. Documentary at the moment. I mean, you know, I'd love one, but it doesn't happen at the moment.
Anybody else work with assistants?
I did have an assistant for a certain amount of time. I had archive researchers, but I had an assistant who was helping me assemble I was cutting 2 films in a series of 3, and he was helping assemble material for the second film that I was doing. And so what he was doing was he was watching what I was doing on the first film, and I'd send him, and then I'd task him with I'd already sync cut a lot of the interviews for that film, and I would task him with actually assembling first cuts of scenes with interview and archive. So I'd give him the archive, which again I'd been through. So going back to what we were talking about where you start, I mean, I'd been through the interviews, and then I went through all the archive and marked all the archive up, and then and subclipped it all up, so we knew where it was supposed to be used, or in the general where it's supposed to be used. And then I let him loose on it, and he did a lot of cutting for that second episode, or initial cutting, as well as doing initial, because we got interviews coming in late, he would go through those as well, and follow my system for going through those interviews. But I mean, as Sean was saying, you know, he didn't have an assistant. I only had an assistant for about 3 weeks on total of 28. So it wasn't long, but it was invaluable. And he's now cutting away himself. You know, he's fully fledged editor. So yeah, it was very useful. Really, really useful at the time. Really helped time-wise massively.
Thank you. That's very good to know. We are really over time. Yeah.
David,
Sure.
David, did you have an assistant on Get Back?
Yes, I had an assistant.
For the assistant.
Yeah, I had 2 different assistants at different times. There was an assistant all the way through the whole project. I guess it sort of, his work was divided in 2, like towards the back half, it was all the outputs and handing things to other departments, like the sound department and online and things, because we had a lot of changes and updates. But the real big work for the assistants on Get Back was in the preparation of the footage. There was no, you know, it was all shot 50 years ago with separate sound and separate picture, and there were no clapperboards or anything because they didn't want to disturb the band. So there was a lot of eye matching or ear matching of footage that had happened. And the other big technical problem was the cameras they used back then were not running at real speed. They would drift, and they would drift differently to each other. So the cameras, you know, if most of the sessions were shot with 2 cameras, and if they happened to both be running at the same time, which was pretty rare, but when they would, you know, after a minute or so, they would drift and be out of sync with each other. They also had 2 Nagra recorders recording the sound at different times. You know, technically 1 for each camera, but they sort of they just ran separately. And you know, Nagras are pretty good at keeping speed, but we would have to adjust the speed of the Nagras to match the camera, and then adjust it again to match the other camera, and then adjust the second Nagra to match the first camera, and the second Nagra to match the second camera. And then occasionally we'd have 8-track recordings as well, which would have to be adjusted for each camera. So you'd end up with, you know, stacks of different sound possibilities. And, you know, so the guys, you know, did a lot of work with that. And then, you know, you'd have all this audio that you thought had no picture, and you'd have picture you think has no sound. And then occasionally you'd work out, well, actually, maybe this bit of audio might fit this picture, and, you know, you'd try it out. And so there were months and months of assistant work prepping the footage. It began at Apple Corps, you know, years ago, and they did a lot of work. And then when we took the project over, there was even more to do, and we kept doing it. So yeah, it was a lot of preparation.
Yeah, I noticed in the credits they were sort of decades apart, the various editors.
Yeah, we in the credits we listed all the crew who worked on the project 50 years ago. In terms of the shooting crew, that was totally appropriate because it was their footage and things. But we ended up listing everyone, the editors who had worked on Let It Be 50 years ago, even though we did sort of start again afresh. We put all the rushes back together and started again. But it was a long time between shoot and finish.
Fantastic project for an editor and brilliantly cut.
We're just 5 blocks away from that very roof, by the way.
There you go.
Nice.
Got to go up there.
Are you in New Zealand now?
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is more a virtual cup of tea than a virtual.
Can I just ask you if you ever listened to that album?
To the Let It Be album?
Yeah. Now.
Yeah, absolutely.
You haven't got insanely bored of the.
No. I think that was one of the big questions. Was this gonna, drive me mad and stop me being able to ever listen to the music again? But it was surprising. It didn't. It survived.
Stand the test of time.
It led me back to the Naked album, the Naked Let It Be album.
Yes.
I've listened to nothing else since watching your doc.
Right. Yeah, no, that's there has been, and of course it's just come out again, a new mix of the album. And one of the great things on the box set that Apple has just released is that they got Glyn Johns, the original producer and engineer from 50 years ago, was brought back in to actually finish his mix of the album, which had never been released before because of politics and things, and the whole project got taken over and given to Phil Spector to mix, and he added a lot of violins and choirs and things, which wasn't always what the band wanted. I mean, which was an amazing thing to find out that the Beatles at the height of their power, Paul McCartney didn't have the right to say how he wanted his songs mixed. So it's happened, and they've finally finished the 50-year-old mix of the album.
I thought George Martin always mixed them. I didn't realise.
Up to the end, the whole, why did the Beatles break up, and that I think basically comes down to, a new manager was brought in '69, an American Alan Klein, who 3 of them wanted and 1 of them didn't. Paul didn't want him, and that sort of led to the fighting and the lawsuits and everything. And Alan Klein, with John and probably George's backing, gave the tapes to Phil Spector to do what he wanted with them. And George Martin has a famous line that he said, when he was told that Phil Spector was going to get the producer credit on Let It Be, he said it should say produced by George Martin, overproduced by Phil Spector.
Yeah, we can use that on other programs now.
Yeah.
Over exact.
Exactly.
In that same wave, can I ask Cara and Mariko if you are actually into noise music, or if you are now, or if you were not before? Mm-hmm.
Well, the reason why I got involved in this project was because Lisa had seen a short film that I made about one of the women, Delia Derbyshire. So I was kind of already a fan of that genre and knew a bit about it and stuff. So I still listen to lots of music by electronic.
Because I saw that she was involved, and I did see the film. That was a London Film Festival, that one. So you do have a connection with that. Cool.
Yeah.
I didn't have a connection.
And
I've done a few music documentaries where I had no connection, but I started really digging the music afterwards.
how you
It's catchy, huh?
it's just so interesting, and to see, I mean, because now, you know, the noise electronic scene is not like that, and you see these sort of grandmas with like flowers, foulards, you know, doing harsh noise, and it's like, what?
Bewildering. It was bewildering.
Mind blowing. Is that literally grandma playing? Like I imagine my grandma listening to that music, and I'm like, what? So it's really, yeah, weird image. And
But music has this very powerful way of expressing something very unique as well. You right away understand where their soul is at that point in time somehow.
I love that. I love that film. I just thought it was a whole world sort of brought to me, sort of new, sort of vaguely new, but I just thought it was all sort of brilliantly achieved and unfolded perfectly. It's like hearing the music. I loved all the contrasting characters. I loved the way they sort of been intercut with each other, and they came back later, and I was desperate to see what they all looked like, and then you realise, you know, aren't there anymore. It was all sort of revealed at the end. I loved all that. Very good.
The music also has this physicality, like the cycles, and you get really honed into, you start tapping into these cycles which dictate how you edit as well. Yeah, you have to be kind of
it's hard to end a scene. Hard to end a scene sometimes. You just want to let the music keep going.
Yeah, the feature had that advantage that we could let it be, like we could go down that road, which was lovely. I would really appreciate that.
Cinema with top sound.
So, Claudia, would you like to conclude the session? I think, or maybe we can just.
Yeah, I think
because it's 9 o'clock, so we've been going for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And so thank you so much for being with us. It was really so nice and incredible to hear from you all, and thank you also from all the other people who came here to listen. And yeah, so we are doing these events once a week until the end of April. So, and the winners will be revealed on the 20, Roberta, help me, 27th.
29th.
29th. So, I mean, of course, in the end, awards like that are a bit subjective, so it's not that maybe who wins it best. So it was actually like this evening was the most beautiful thing for us, and thank you really for being here. We hope that you also had a nice time and you like to meet also with other fellas. So.
And so we will stop the recording.
Thank you.
And